The price of winning. When fortune costs everything. The answer hit the Family Feud studio like a confession whispered in church. Not loud, but devastating. The kind of truth that strips away everything comfortable and leaves only raw reality exposed under the bright lights. 58-year-old Frank O'Sullivan stood at the contestant podium, his calloused hands gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. Steve Harvey had asked what seemed like a straightforward question, the kind that usually generated crowd-pleasing responses and kept the energy flowing. We asked 100 people, name something money can't buy. He'd expected the typical answers that made for good television. Love, maybe, happiness, health, time. The kinds of responses that would light up the board and remind everyone of life's simple truths before moving on to the next question. Instead, Frank looked directly into Steve's eyes with the haunted expression of someone who had learned the hardest way possible, that getting everything you've ever wanted can cost you everything that actually mattered, and said 5 words that would transform this episode from entertainment into something approaching tragedy. The family I had before. The studio fell silent, not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the heavy silence that follows a truth so painful it forces everyone to confront their own assumptions about success, happiness, and what really matters in life. Steve's signature smile faltered as he processed what he'd heard, recognizing something in Frank's voice that went beyond typical game show drama. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't part of any show format they'd trained for. Contestants were supposed to be upbeat, entertaining, grateful for their moment in the spotlight. They weren't supposed to reveal the devastating cost of dreams come true on national television. Frank O'Sullivan had been a union plumber for 36 years, working construction sites across Boston, installing pipes in office buildings and luxury condos he could never afford to live in. He was the kind of man who showed up early, worked hard, and went home to a modest 3-bedroom house in Southie, where he'd raised 3 kids with his wife Maureen. For decades, their Friday night ritual had been buying lottery tickets at Murphy's Corner Store, dreaming about what they'd do if they ever hit it big. 6 months ago, their dreams came true. $50 million after taxes. The kind of money that transforms everything it touches. The kind of money that Frank thought would solve every problem, fulfill every wish, make his family's life perfect. Instead, it had destroyed everything he'd spent 58 years building. "Mr. O'Sullivan," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. Something in Frank's expression had triggered every instinct Steve had developed over decades of reading people. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a man drowning in the very thing he'd thought would save him. "What do you mean by that?" Steve asked gently. The question opened floodgates that Frank had been trying to keep sealed since the day the numbers were called. His composure, maintained through months of lawyers and financial advisors and family meetings, that felt more like business negotiations than conversations with people he loved, began to crumble. "I mean," Frank said, his Boston accent thick with emotion, "that 6 months ago I had a family who called me because they wanted to talk. Now I have a family who calls me because they want something." The O'Sullivan family stood at their team podium. His wife Maureen, his daughter Katie, his sons Sean and Michael, all of them shifting uncomfortably as their private pain was exposed under studio lights. What had started as a fun family outing to celebrate their good fortune had become something none of them were prepared for. "Before we won," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength even as tears gathered in his eyes, "my kids called me Dad. Now they call me an investment opportunity. My daughter Katie, she hasn't asked me how I'm doing in 4 months, but she's got a business plan for a boutique that she wants me to fund." The rival family, the Washingtons from Detroit, stood frozen at their podium. They'd come to compete, maybe win some money, have a story to tell back home. Instead, they found themselves witnessing the unraveling of the American dream, watching a man who had won everything discover that everything wasn't enough. "My son Sean," Frank said, looking directly at the young man who stood 3 feet away but felt like miles, He used to come over every Sunday for dinner. Maureen would make her famous lasagna, and we'd watch the Patriots game together. Now he comes over every Sunday to pitch me some cryptocurrency scheme or real estate deal. Steve found himself moving closer to Frank, drawn by something he recognized but couldn't name. Maybe it was the understanding that comes from knowing what it's like when success changes how people see you. Maybe it was recognizing the particular loneliness that comes from never knowing if you're loved for who you are or what you have. "And your wife?" Steve asked quietly. Frank glanced at Maureen, who stood at the family podium with tears streaming down her face. After 35 years of marriage, they could communicate with just a look, and what passed between them was heartbreaking in its complexity. Love mixed with loss, gratitude mixed with grief. "Maureen tries," Frank said softly. "God knows she tries. But even she's changed. She used to argue with me about spending $20 on a shirt. Now she talks about our portfolio and investment strategies and whether we should buy a second home in Florida." The studio audience was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. 300 people held their breath as this man who should have been celebrating instead mourned what money had taken from him. "I thought winning the lottery would mean never having to worry about money again," Frank continued, as if speaking to himself as much as to Steve. "What I didn't realize is that it would mean never knowing if anyone cares about me or just cares about my bank account." Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless stories of triumph and tragedy. But standing there looking at Frank O'Sullivan, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment value. He saw a man who had gotten everything he thought he wanted and lost everything he actually needed. "Frank," Steve said, using his first name now, making the connection more personal, "when was the last time you felt like yourself? Not Frank the lottery winner, but Frank the person." The question seemed to catch Frank completely off guard. He paused, thinking, as if trying to remember a version of himself that used to exist. "About a week before the drawing," he answered slowly. "I was fixing Mrs. Patterson's kitchen sink. She's our neighbor, 86 years old, lives alone. I wouldn't take any money for it because she's on a fixed income. We sat at her kitchen table afterward, drinking coffee and talking about her grandson who was starting college." "That sounds nice," Steve said encouragingly. "It was perfect," Frank said, his voice filled with longing. "Just two people talking, no agenda, no one wanting anything except conversation. Mrs. Patterson asked me about my work, about Maureen, about whether we were excited about becoming grandparents when Katie's baby arrives." Frank paused, lost in the memory of a simpler time that felt like it belonged to someone else. "Now when I see Mrs. Patterson, she's nervous around me," he continued. "She apologizes for asking me to look at her sink, as if I'm too important now to help my neighbors. My buddies at work, guys I've known for 20 years, they act like I'm a different person. They don't invite me for beers after work anymore, because they think I've moved on to better things." The Washington family, their competitors in this forgotten game, had abandoned any pretense of competition. Robert Washington, a factory worker who had been laid off twice in the past 5 years, watched Frank with a mixture of sympathy and confusion, trying to understand how winning could feel like losing. "But you have financial security now," Steve said, playing devil's advocate. "You don't have worry about bills or retirement or—" "You're right," Frank interrupted. "I'll never worry about money again, but I'll spend the rest of my life worrying about whether anyone loves Frank O'Sullivan or just loves Frank O'Sullivan's money." The camera caught Maureen in the audience, her face crumpling as she heard her husband articulate fears she'd been trying to pretend weren't real. After 35 years of marriage, she knew Frank better than anyone, and she could see what the money was doing to the man she loved. "Frank," Steve said, his voice carrying new gravity, "what's the hardest part?" "The hardest part," Frank said, and now his voice was thick with emotion, "is that I can't go back. I can't unwin the money. I can't return to the life where my kids called me because they missed me, where my wife was proud of me for being a good man instead of a rich man, where my friends saw me as Frank instead of seeing dollar signs. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, calloused from decades of honest work that suddenly felt meaningless in the face of unearned wealth. I used to be proud of what I did, Frank continued. I fixed things. I made things work. People needed me because of my skills, my experience, my willingness to show up when something was broken. Now people need me because of my bank account, and I feel like I haven't earned anything. Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about being ungrateful or not appreciating good fortune. This was about identity, about self-worth, about what happens when external circumstances change so dramatically that you lose sight of who you are underneath it all. My grandson Jimmy, Frank said, his voice breaking. He's 5 years old. Before we won, when I'd visit, he'd run to the door shouting, "Grandpa," and want me to read him stories or help him build with his Legos. Last week I visited, and the first thing he said was, "Grandpa, did you bring me something expensive?" The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed loud. Camera operators who had filmed hundreds of tapings found themselves emotionally invested in ways that surprised them. In the control room, producers who usually focused on timing and commercial breaks were wondering how to handle content that was this raw, this real. 5 years old, Frank repeated, and he's already learned that Grandpa's value is measured by what he can buy, not who he is. Steve Harvey had built his career on understanding people, on reading what made them laugh or cry, or connect with each other. But standing there looking at Frank O'Sullivan, he saw something that transcended entertainment. He saw a man who had won the jackpot and lost himself. "Frank," Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance quality. "What do you want?" "I want my family back," Frank answered, immediately. "Not the family that sees me as a resource, be managed, but the family that saw me as a person to be loved. I want my kids to call me because they had a bad day at work and need their dad, not because they need an investor. I want my wife to argue with me about spending money on stupid things because it means we're partners making decisions together." Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was navy blue, expensive, perfectly turtle. It represented success, achievement, the kind of material prosperity that Frank had thought he wanted. "Frank," Steve said, draping the jacket around Frank's shoulders, "this jacket cost more than most people make in a month. You know what that makes it?" Frank looked up at him, confusion mixing with curiosity. "Just a jacket," Steve said firmly. "It keeps me warm. It looks professional, but it doesn't make me a better person. It doesn't make me a better father or husband or friend. It's just fabric and thread that happens to be expensive." The jacket was a perfect fit for Frank's broad shoulders, but somehow it looked wrong on him, as if pheasant clothes couldn't contain the authenticity of a working man's spirit. "Your money," Steve continued. "It's just money. It doesn't change who you are inside unless you let it. It doesn't change the fact that you're a good man, a loving father, a faithful husband, a skilled tradesman who takes pride in honest work." The audience began to react, not with applause but with the quiet sounds of recognition, murmurs of understanding, gentle sobs, the rustling of tissues being passed between strangers who suddenly grasped that they were witnessing something profound about the human cost of material success. "But how do I get them back?" Frank asked, his voice plaintive. "How do I make my family see Frank the person instead of Frank the bank account?" Steve turned to address not just Frank but his entire family, who stood frozen at their podium, finally hearing truths that had been festering beneath the surface for months. "You start by being Frank the person," Steve said firmly. "You start by setting boundaries. You start by saying no to business proposals and yes to Sunday dinners. You start by asking your kids about their lives instead of listening to their pitches." He looked directly at Katie, Sean, and Michael, his expression stern but compassionate. "And you," he said to Frank's children, You need to decide whether you want a father or a financial advisor. Because you can't have both. Your dad is the same man who taught you how to ride bikes, who stayed up all night when you were sick, who worked double shifts to pay for your college. The only thing that's changed is his bank balance, not his heart. The camera caught the children's faces as Steve's words hit home. Katie reached up to wipe away tears, suddenly seeing her father not as a resource, but as the man who had walked her down the aisle just 3 years ago. Sean and Michael exchanged glances, both recognizing the truth in Steve's words and the shame in their own behavior. "Maureen," Steve said, turning to Frank's wife, "you've been married to this man for 35 years. You know who he is. Don't let money make you forget what made you fall in love with him." Maureen nodded, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her husband across the stage. Really looked at him, seeing past the lottery winner to the man who had been her partner through decades of struggle and joy. "Frank," Steve said, turning back to him, "you can't unwin the money, but you can decide what you do with it. You can decide whether it's going to control your family or whether your family is going to control it." "How?" Frank asked. "You put most of it away," Steve said practically. "You set up trusts, you make investments, you ensure your family's future is secure. But you keep enough to live simply, the way you always live. You go back to work because you want to, not because you have to. You help Mrs. Patterson with her sink because that's who you are." The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about reclaiming and dinning, about choosing values over valuables, about understanding that the most important things in life can't be bought but can be lost. "And your family learns that your love isn't for sale," Steve continued. "They learn that Sundays innards are for family time, not business meetings. They learn that Grandpa's value isn't measured in dollars but in stories and hugs and time spent building Lego castles." Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph, creased from years of handling. It showed the O'Sullivan family at Katie's wedding 3 years ago, all of them laughing, arms around each other, faces glowing with genuine happiness and love. "This was us before," Frank said, showing the photo to Steve. "Look at their faces. Look at how they looked at me. I wasn't Frank the lottery winner. I was just Dad." Steve studied the photo, then looked back at Frank's family, then at Frank himself. "You can be that again," Steve said, with absolute conviction. "Money didn't change who you are, Frank. It just gave you new choices about who you want to be. Choose to be the man in this photograph." The studio erupted in applause. But it wasn't typical game show applause. It was the sound of recognition, of healing, of hope, that what had been broken could be repaired. As confetti fell and the celebration music played, something unprecedented happened. Instead of staying at their separate podiums, the O'Sullivan family came together at center stage. Katie was the first to move, crossing the stage to hug her father, really hug him, the way she used to before money complicated everything. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "I forgot who you were because I got distracted by what you had." Sean and Michael followed, and then Maureen, and suddenly the O'Sullivan family was a family again, holding each other under the bright lights as America watched a millionaire lottery winner discover that the most valuable things he owned couldn't be deposited in any bank. 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a letter from Boston. It came with a photograph showing Frank O'Sullivan in his work clothes, standing next to Mrs. Patterson's newly renovated kitchen, both of them smiling over coffee and homemade cookies. "Mr. Harvey," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that we found our way back each other. We put 90% of the money in trusts and investments for the kids and grandkids. We kept enough to pay off our house and live comfortably, but not enough to change who we are. I went back to work, not because I had to, but because I missed being useful, missed fixing things, missed being valued for what I could do with my hands instead of what I had in my bank account." The letter continued. "Katie's boutique is doing well. She funded it herself through a small business loan, and she's prouder of it than she would have been if I'd just written her a check. Sean started his own contracting business, using skills I taught him instead of money I gave him. Michael is finishing his teaching degree, and Maureen and I are planning a trip to Ireland for our 40th anniversary. Not because we can afford it now, but because we've earned it together. But the most important part came at the end. Jimmy asked me to help him build a birdhouse last weekend. When I offered to buy him a fancy one from the store, he said, "No, Grandpa, I want to make one with you." I realized then that he doesn't need a rich grandfather. He needs a grandfather who has time, attention, and love to give. The money can't buy that, but it also can't take it away unless I let it. Today, Frank O'Sullivan still has millions in the bank, but he measures his wealth differently. He counts Sunday dinners with no business talk, grandchildren who value his time more than his money, neighbors who still ask for help because they know he'll say yes, and a wife who argues with him about spending $60 on work boots because she's looking out for their future together. The lottery ticket that changed everything taught Frank that winning isn't about getting what you want. It's about not losing what you already have. And sometimes the most expensive lesson you can learn is that the things money can't buy are also the things money can't replace once you've lost them. But they can be found again if you're willing to choose love over luxury, relationships over riches, and the man you are over the money you have. Frank O'Sullivan learned that the real jackpot isn't hitting the numbers. It's knowing that the people who matter love you for your heart, not your bank account.